The Trump administration just joined a lawsuit against UCLA Medical School, and at first glance, that might sound like something that law school applicants can safely ignore. But that would be a mistake, because what happened in that case didn't just affect a medical school, it has quietly changed how every single law school admissions office in the country now has to think, even if no law school is ever actually sued. And that's the part almost nobody is explaining clearly. So let me walk you through it. Here is what actually happened. The Department of Justice didn't just criticize UCLA or issue guidance or send a warning letter, they joined a lawsuit. And by doing that, they have forced the release of internal admissions data, real numbers across multiple years, showing how test scores lined up across different groups. And that is the key moment here, not the lawsuit itself, but the data. Because for decades, elite professional schools operated under a quiet assumption. They believed their internal admission spreadsheets, the stuff they never publish, was basically private unless they lost a massive court case, and that assumption is now gone. UCLA didn't lose first. The government just stepped in, and suddenly the data was public, and that changes the rules. Now, here's where law schools come in. Law schools, of course, don't use the MCAT, they use the LSAT. It's a different test, but it has the same role, it functions the same way. And law schools are already under intense numerical pressure. The rankings, the median, scholarship competition, yield management. Every law school already has internal dashboards showing who they admit, who they deny, who gets scholarship money, and how all of that lines up with LSAT scores. But they don't publish that data by choice, of course. But now they have to assume the federal government could see it at some point in the future. And once that assumption exists, their behavior is going to change fast. And this is what applicants never see. After something like the UCLA lawsuit happens, general counsel doesn't sit around waiting. They email admissions. And the question is not, are we technically compliant? The question is, what does this look like if someone asks for our data? And that single question reshapes everything, not publicly or dramatically, but quietly. Now, here's the first real consequence. Borderline applicants are going to get squeezed. Law schools don't eliminate discretion, they reduce risk. So you start seeing narrower LSAT ranges, fewer exceptions, and less willingness to stretch below the medians. If you are below a school's LSAT median, you're no longer just competing against other applicants, you're competing against the school's tolerance for public scrutiny. Now, and secondly, and this is huge, scholarships tighten before admissions does. Scholarship data is much harder to defend than admissions offers. If two applicants look similar on paper, but get wildly different aid, that's easy to question later. So schools respond by tightening LSAT cutoffs for big scholarships, reducing discretionary awards, and standardizing their aid bands. Which means this: a higher LSAT doesn't just help you get in, it protects your scholarship leverage. And that matters more now than it did even a couple of cycles ago. Now let's talk about holistic review, because this part gets misunderstood. Law schools will say they do holistic review, and that's true, but the space where holistic review operates is shrinking. Think of it like this: numbers decide whether you're safe, but holistic factors decide who gets picked within the safe group, and that is a subtle change. But it's a massive one for applicants who are counting on their stories to compensate for lower numbers. Of course, stories still matter, but they matter after the numbers clear the risk threshold, after the numbers bring you above a certain bar. So why is this happening now? Because the Supreme Court has already banned race-based admissions preferences, but what's happening now is enforcement through exposure. The government doesn't need to sue every single university, and it doesn't need to win every single case. They've just got to show they can see inside the process. And once that's clear, the institutions will adjust on their own because it's faster, it's cheaper, and it works. And law schools understand this immediately. And law schools specifically are pretty sensitive, vulnerable targets because they train judges, they feed regulatory agencies, and that makes them visible. And that makes them cautious. So what does this mean for you practically as an applicant? If you're applying to law school in the next couple of years, the reality is that law schools are becoming more risk averse. And risk averse schools don't make gambles on borderline numbers unless they absolutely have to, which means that being above the median matters more, their margins are going to be tighter, and being interesting but risky is going to be a harder sell. Of course, this doesn't mean personal statements don't matter, but it means they work best on top of already strong numbers, not as a substitute for those numbers. So here's the takeaway I want you to actually act on. In an environment where law schools fear scrutiny, numbers protect everybody. Your LSAT is still the cleanest, safest, most defensible signal in the entire process. And when institutions are optimizing for defensibility and safety, that signal is going to carry more weight, not less, because the real fallout from this UCLA med school lawsuit is not another headline, it's the quiet shifts with all the other graduate schools watching this, happening behind the scenes. And by the time that most applicants realize the rules changed, the cycle's already going to be over. And so if you're looking for support, getting your LSAT numbers up, getting above the medians of the schools you're targeting to make those schools safety schools, not reaches, if you want to get more scholarship money, I'm here to help. I'm offering free LSAT tutoring lessons, private one-on-one over Zoom video for everybody watching this now or later. The link to book that free call with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. The link is below this video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, and in my bio on TikTok and Instagram. That is an open offer for everyone. I'm happy to help. And by the way, folks, for those of you who are new here, I do these lives every single weekday, same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific, here on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, wherever you might be watching this. If you find this helpful, please spread the word. The only way this grows is through word of mouth. I don't do any advertising for these lives, and the algorithm doesn't really boost lives because they can't run ads during them. So if you could share this to your socials, share it in Discord, subreddits, Facebook groups, group chats, wherever you know other pre-laws, it really does make a difference. I do appreciate your support. I see some questions coming in here. I'll get to as many of those as I can. Keep them coming. I see Marion's asking, if you have a high GPA and a 170 LSAT, are you practically guaranteed a spot in any top 14 law school? No, I wouldn't go quite that far. I mean, there are no guarantees in life, no guarantees in admissions. Every cycle's different. And a 170 LSAT, you might be surprised to know, that actually puts you below the medians of most of the top 14 law schools. So most of the top 14 law schools actually have LSAT medians of 170 to 174. So a 170 alone is actually on the low end. If you wanted to be practically guaranteed, I'd want you to have a 180 and a 4.0 GPA. Of course, easier said than done. If you had a 175 plus LSAT and a 4.0 GPA, you're probably getting into a lot of the T14. But with only a 170 LSAT, you might actually be below a lot of the LSAT medians, believe it or not. And I know it's crazy, but LSAT score inflation's real. A 170 LSAT puts you in the top 4% of test takers, meaning that there are still plenty of people who got LSATs higher than you. But a 175 puts you in the top 1% above many of the other applicants. And when we say high GPA, what does high mean, right? For some folks, a 3.7 sounds high as a GPA, but it's actually below the medians for all the T14. Their GPA medians are roughly 3.9 because grade inflation is also real. So if you want to know what the actual numbers are for any given law school, you just Google any given law school's name and the number 509, and you will be able to see the American Bar Association 509 reports, and you'll be able to see the exact numbers, concrete medians for every ABA-approved law school. You'll see the LSAT median, the GPA median for last year's entering class, of course. Those are last year's numbers, and every law school is looking to raise their numbers, and because of GPA inflation and LSAT inflation, the numbers are always going up. So aim to be on the high end, aim to be at, ideally, the 75th percentile for both LSAT and GPA to be a shoo-in to get virtually guaranteed admission. Let's see, other questions. Thanks for all these folks. I see Sunfish is asking, how long should the average student study for the LSAT in your opinion? I recommend a minimum of studying for 2 to 3 months, ideally studying for 5 to 6 months to reach your fullest potential on the LSAT. Can you do it in less time? Sure you can, but for the best outcomes to reach your fullest potential, more time is better. especially given the relative importance of the LSAT, right? Because the LSAT is the biggest factor in the law school admissions process. It weighs more heavily than all of undergrad combined, just 1 day, 2.5 hours, but it weighs more heavily than your entire undergraduate GPA. So it's worth putting in 5 to 6 months to get to your goal score. And we could talk through what a study plan could look like, of course. You want to build your foundation, learning the different sections, the different question types, drilling questions by type. There's roughly 15 to 17 different types of logical reasoning questions, depending on how you count them. You got strength and weaken, flaw, necessary assumption, sufficient assumption, resolve, and so on. Then there's reading comp to work on. You've also got pacing and time management, doing individual sections, and full-length exams to build up your endurance. So to do all of that and more, it takes time. We want you to do at least 10 full-length timed exams before the big day, so test day itself feels like just another run-through, but everything I just said, tough to cram it all into just 2 to 3 months, and so we want to give you more time. And we craft personalized study plans for all of our students inside the LSAT Unplugged coaching program, given your current score, your goal score, your time frame, what law schools you want to go to, how much time you can put in per day and per week. If you want to talk through the particulars, of course, the best way to do that for free is to book a free LSAT tutoring lesson with me through the link in my bio, the link below the video. Happy to talk through it more. I see Uzaro is asking, what is the best major to be a lawyer? Well, the cool thing is that you can major in literally anything and go to law school. You can major in STEM. You can major in humanities. Doesn't matter. There are no prerequisites for going to law school. It really just matters what's your LSAT score, what's your GPA. Now, because it's just your numbers, you might want to pick a major where you're likely to get a high GPA, and it's harder to get a high GPA in STEM majors because they're less forgiving, they're more brutally curved. In the humanities, there's more grade inflation, just being real about it, folks. And so if your sole purpose, your sole goal was to get into law school, you might want to choose an easier major. I hate to say that because I wish that undergrad was more about studying what you're actually interested in, but you can get punished when it comes to grades for venturing outside of your comfort zone. So if law school is truly what you want to do, you're virtually certain of that. You want to take easier classes, get easier A's. If you're not sure whether law school is right for you and you want to potentially not go to law school, you might want to consider a different major given that. But your mileage may vary. Choose what's best for you given your goals and given your time frame. But law schools don't care what you majored in. The major, of course, gives some context. If you did STEM and hurt your GPA, they'll see that, they'll know it. But law schools are very driven by the US News rankings, of course, and the rankings don't care what your major was. They just care what the number is. Raisin Brand's asking, is it plausible to go to a top 30 law school and just plan to transfer into the T14 law schools? Technically possible, yes. Is it likely? Not so much. Transferring is easier said than done. There's usually some inertia when it comes to transferring schools, meaning once you're starting off law school, there's a switching cost. It's easier to just stay where you're currently at, and there's no guarantee that you'll be able to transfer somewhere else. So my recommendation is don't start at any law school where you wouldn't be happy staying all 3 years, where you wouldn't be happy both spending the time and also earning the JD from that particular school. If you want to switch, of course, you can try, but a lot of folks plan to transfer and never actually do, and there's no guarantee that you'll get taken in as a transfer or that a seat will open up. Very few people get in as transfers. So I wouldn't bank on it. You can hope for it, of course, you can try for it, but I would only start somewhere you actually want to stay throughout. Kelsey's asking, this may sound silly, but is the LSAT in the US and Canada the same? Not silly at all, because the admissions process is different in different countries, but the LSAT exam itself is the same anywhere you take it, whether it's US or Canada. It's the same format, the same sections, 2 scored logical reasoning sections, 1 scored reading comprehension section, 1 unscored extra section of either logical reasoning or reading comprehension. There's also the unscored writing sample as well that you take as a separate administration, but all of that's the same in both the US and Canada. Fun fact, in Puerto Rico, they administer the LSAT in Spanish. For folks who are applying to law school in Puerto Rico, there's also an LSAT India exam for use in India, but that's where law is an undergraduate level degree. The LSAT India only has four choices in the multiple choice, not 5 choices like the LSAT in North America, but that's just trivia, of course. You want to take it in the same format you'll take the official. Just scanning through for other questions here. Thanks for all of these, folks. Keep them coming. No is asking, is it too late to apply for the fall if I'm taking the February LSAT? So no, the February LSAT is not too late for this cycle. The January LSAT's also not too late, of course. And so for those of you who got your January LSAT scores back a couple days ago, you're good. If you apply today, tomorrow, that's totally fine. February LSAT scores come back February 25th. That's also not too late for this cycle. I would recommend working on your application materials in the meantime. So your personal statement, your optional essays, your addenda, your resume, your letters of rec, pull all of that together. Of course, if you're in the final week before your LSAT, focus on that. But then you've got approximately 2 to 3 weeks between taking the LSAT and getting your score back. So during those 2 to 3 weeks between, say, February 7th and February 25th, you want to pull all of that together, get all your ducks in the row so that you can hit submit the second that your score comes back in February. There's also the LSAT coming up in April in about 10 weeks, the June LSAT in roughly 4 months or so. For either of those LSATs, you're probably better off taking it, but then applying to start law school, then applying this fall in September of 2026 to start law school in fall of 2027. When you apply that late in the current cycle, finishing up now, with an April result or a June LSAT result, there's less scholarship money available. It's a bit harder to get in. Of course, you can retake the LSAT for reconsideration, maybe to get some more scholarship money, but I would not apply for the first time that late in this cycle in most cases. And many schools won't even take the results. They've already shut their doors. Some will not have, of course. The lower ranked schools might still have seats. You can always reach out and ask, but it's to be avoided in most cases. Brooke is asking, are you supposed to take the practice tests on LSAC? It's a good idea. I mean, the LSAC Law Hub platform is the best place to take official LSAT practice tests because that's the only platform, the only software that replicates exactly what test day is going to be like. If you take practice tests out of a book or on some unofficial third-party platform, first of all, the questions might not even be real official practice questions. And then secondly, you're not getting familiar with the functionality. And one reason that students' scores often drop from their practice test to the official exam is because they're not familiar with the look and feel of test day, the highlighting, the underlining features and such, the line spacing, the font size. So all of that, I think Law Hub is the best place to do them. You get 4 practice tests on there for free. And then with your Law Hub Advantage subscription of $120 a year, well worth the investment, by the way, you get all of the other practice tests. There are currently 59 of them, numbered 101 to 159. And there's roughly 8,000 practice questions in total. More than enough, of course. But that's the best place to do them. I see Luke is asking, what is the likelihood of having a lower GPA, like a 3 to 3.4, and getting into a good law school? Well, define good. And there's also the biggest missing piece, which is the LSAT score. So if you have a 3.4 GPA and a 175 plus LSAT, you can definitely still get in somewhere good. If you have a 3.4 GPA and a 160 LSAT, yeah, the outcomes are not going to be quite as good. For any given law school, just look up the stats, look up the requirements, look up the medians, and you'll get a sense of where you're competitive. But I can't chance anybody if we're missing the number one factor, which is the LSAT score. So you can play around with different predictor softwares and see what the formula would be, what it would output if you input your LSAT score or any given hypothetical LSAT score and your GPA. You'll be able to get a sense of where you'd be competitive, and you get a sense of what kind of LSAT score is going to be required. And if you want to talk through what it might take for you to get that given LSAT score, as folks are asking about here, yes, I do offer free LSAT tutoring, private one-on-one lessons with everybody watching this open offer, by the way, now or later. My link to book that free tutoring is unpluggedprep.com/start. Links below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG. Open offer for everybody watching this now or later. Happy to help. I know my voice is a little hoarse right now. I've been doing these calls all week, and then we had the big score release live earlier this week. So apologies for that, but I'm happy to help. And if you don't see any open availability, just reach out and I'll do what I can to help. I love In-N-Out Burger is asking, and I love it too, by the way, is there a significant difference between a 159 and a 160 LSAT score? Yes and no, right? I mean, 159 versus 160 is just 1 point, but there's also an optics difference. The 1.6 looks a lot nicer than the 1.5, just like a 170 looks a lot better than a 169. And strangely enough, if you actually look at law school acceptance data, someone did some kind of statistical analysis showing that law school adcoms themselves, the admissions officers, are also subject to that optical bias around that difference, the 10th there, the 170 versus 169. And so you get more than the benefit of a single point by getting your score up into that next level. So if you have a 159 on your official LSAT, you might want to retake just to get the 160. Or if you're at the 169, you might want to retake just to get the 170. It's silly, but it matters. And so it's worth retaking. And folks often ask me, is there any penalty to retaking? Is it bad to retake multiple times? And honestly, it's not bad to retake. Law schools do not average multiple LSAT scores. They only take into consideration the highest score on your record. And so if you retake and do better, you're now applying with a higher score and benefiting from that higher score. If you retake and you do worse, no big deal. They'll see the lower score if you don't cancel it, but ultimately you will not be penalized or harmed by it, which makes sense, of course, because law schools themselves are not evaluated based on how many times you took it or the average of your scores. They only have to report the highest score on your score report to the American Bar Association. And in turn, that's where US News pulls their data from for inclusion in the ever important US News Law School rankings. So worth retaking if you think you can do better. And if you want to improve, of course, you've got 10 weeks till April, 4 months till June, plenty of time to improve 20 points. I see someone's asking how long would it take to improve from a 139 to a 160. I mean, if you're able to study significantly, like if you're able to put in at least 15, 20 hours per week, you might be able to get there by April. If you can only put in less time, maybe you want to allow till June. I don't like to promise overnight success or make any kind of outlandish claims or guarantees. Ultimately, your improvement's going to be a function of the amount that you study and the way in which you study, right? So it's the combination of those two factors. It's not just working harder, it's working smarter. So we got to put in the time, but we also got to put in the right sort of analysis. And so we use this framework called the Socratic review method in our courses and in our coaching programs. And it's essentially root cause analysis, right? So we're looking at what are you getting wrong and why are you getting it wrong? Is your mistake coming from the argument or the passage? Is it coming from the question stem, or is it coming from the answer choices? Is it a tempting wrong answer leading you astray? Is it an unappealing right answer that's discouraging you from picking it? We've got to dig into the nitty gritty essentially. And that's what we do in the coaching. For the April LSAT, for those of you aiming for that target test date and you want to improve significantly, we would take a more intensive boot camp style approach where you get live coaching 7 days a week. If you're taking in June, we can take a more slow and steady approach, give you a day off here or there so that you don't burn out, and do a more relaxed pace. We always want to customize it to getting you from your current score to your goal score in your time frame. And so if you want to, Zora, if you want to talk through the particulars, of course, feel free to book the free tutoring lesson with me and we could talk through it specifically. I see Raheem saying you watched my videos back when you studied. Now you passed the bar. You're an attorney. Awesome. Congrats. I always love hearing those success stories. Sunfish is asking, can a 180 LSAT carry my lackluster GPA? It can do a lot to make up for it. I mean, law school admissions is primarily a function of your LSAT score and your GPA. Admissions officers use what they call an admissions index, a formula where they weight your LSAT relative to your GPA. They weigh your LSAT score more heavily, and that spits out your chances more or less. Of course, soft factors do play some role, but it's primarily numbers driven. And so your LSAT can do a lot to make up for the GPA. And you can't redo all of undergrad, of course. It's not practical to do so, but your LSAT score you can retake and do a lot to make up for it. So your question, I'm aiming for a 170 in June. How can I get there? I haven't taken a diagnostic test. Well, I mean, that might be the first step, right? Take a cold diagnostic, see where you stand. Don't take it as indicative of your potential, of course. Just take it as representing a snapshot of where you are at this given point in time, knowing that, of course, you can improve significantly. The LSAT's kind of like a foreign language because It's not really how we speak or write in everyday life. It's very specific, very technical, very precise, like a contract, for example. And so you've got to adjust to their way of thinking, seeing the reasoning from their perspective, right? So absorbing the patterns in the logic of the test. And so if you have 4 months till June to get that 170, you're going to want to familiarize yourself with the different questions, the different sections, the different methods of reasoning. There are tons of different question types and tons of different methods of reasoning, right? You've got correlation, causation, ad hominem personal attacks, confusing necessary and sufficient conditions, system effect, false dilemma. And so the more you familiarize yourself with those methods of reasoning, the quicker your pattern recognition will be, because you're not going to be thinking through or reasoning through the logic of a given argument for the first time on the exam. And that's really how you speed up. What makes a more seasoned student solve questions faster from a newer student is that the more seasoned student has had more exposure to the questions through having done lots of them. And so when they see a new argument, they're not thinking through the logic of that argument for the first time. They've done it all before. And so they're able to see past the window dressing of the topic and get down to the root logic. And so in our coaching programs, we craft for you a personal study plan to walk you through every section, every question type, every method of reasoning, so that by the time test day comes around, you've seen dozens of examples of every sort and you'll be able to solve the questions faster. I see Joseph is asking, could you give some pointers on the personal statement, please? I can, but my first question for you would be, have you already taken the LSAT? Have you already hit your goal score? Because if you haven't, working on application essays is more of a distraction or a procrastination tactic than anything else, right? I mean, given that the LSAT's the number one factor, I want you to lock down that score first and then switch gears. And so if you're taking it in January, if you took the LSAT in January and you haven't yet done your personal statement, yeah, focus on that. If you're taking the LSAT in February, you could work on the personal statement as a break between bouts of LSAT studying and then go hardcore on it during the wait for your score. But if you're taking the LSAT in April or June or August, I'd focus on the LSAT for now. Then once you've taken it, switch gears, work on the essays over the summer, and you'll be able to hit submit the second application's open. All that aside, though, I mean, the biggest mistake I see with personal statements is laundry listing your resume. This is not the place to talk about every single individual impressive thing that you've done. You want to pick one specific story or anecdote or experience and go deeper on it, make it more colorful, share the details, make it come to life, share some insight into your personality. Try to get them to like you, because the LSAT and GPA are numerical and they really drive admissions, but there is a little bit of wiggle room sometimes. And there are folks who outperform their numbers, and that's kind of based on you making a compelling story for why they should accept you in particular. So pick one story. In some way, some part of your application should communicate why you want to go to law school, what your goals are, why it makes sense for you right now at this point in time. Try to share, if you can, that you've had some real world exposure to the real world practice of law, contrary to just pop culture depictions of it, like in Suits or Better Call Saul, for example. But yeah, I'd say really, and one last thing I'll share is, don't make it about politics. Don't give your opinions on world affairs or current events. I mean, it's not the place for you to just share your opinions on things beyond yourself. You want to really make it more concrete and make it about you, not about other people, whether famous people or politicians or about family members. Make it about yourself primarily. Alma's asking, is if I want to go to law school in fall 2027, if that's the goal, would I apply this fall? I want to take my last LSAT this summer. So yeah, ideally, if you want to start law school in fall of 2027, you'd want to apply in fall of 2026, approximately 7 months from now. And you would take the LSAT sometime between now and this fall. So you would take it in April or June or August. I'd probably recommend taking the LSAT in April or June as your first take, and taking it in June or August as your second take, as a backup or as a retake. Because like I say, I recommend everyone retake the LSAT, because you could do better. If so, great. If not, no big deal. And then either way, you can apply as soon as applications open in the fall. I see In-Out Burger saying, my highest practice test was 170, so I was expecting something in the 160 range. And then when I got a 159, I was sad, LOL. Okay, so you dropped from your practice to your actual. I mean, that's unfortunately all too common. I'm sorry to hear that. I mean, students typically drop at least 5 to 8 points from their practice test to the actual exam. And part of that's due to not properly simulating test day conditions using LSAC's Law Hub platform, like I mentioned earlier. It could also be due to nerves or anxiety, a bad proctor, tech issues. And so partially, we want to make sure that you are properly simulating the exam software using Law Hub and strictly timing yourself. You want to use exam mode in Law Hub, which means you're taking 2 timed sections back to back. You've then got a 10-minute break between sections 2 and 3. You're then taking 2 more timed sections back to back, and that's the exam. You're not pausing the clock to check your phone or get a snack or talk to friends or your roommates. And you also just want to raise your baseline. So if you wanted to score, let's say, a 165, you'd ideally want your practice test to be 173 or higher so that you've got a buffer given the typical drop that a lot of folks experience. And of course, you can't assume that you're going to score similar to your highest practice test. You're more likely to score similar to the average of your most recent 5 practice tests that are taken under realistic, strict test day conditions. And again, it may drop a little bit just due to the nerves of it being the real thing. So go in with that expectation and study more. Aim to go above your aim to raise your baseline to that you're scoring above your ultimate goal, given that anything could and maybe will happen. I see Andy Oops asking, what's a good way to break into the law field prior to applying? Do you mean like an internship? I mean, breaking into the law field, like breaking into being an attorney, I mean, you've got to have the JD to practice law, right? You can, of course, get some legal exposure, like working as a paralegal. You can apply to intern as a paralegal over the summer during college, maybe. I actually did that myself during college. I was a paralegal intern for a summer, and it was interesting. I mean, got some real world exposure to what lawyers actually do, and it's definitely not as exciting in many cases as you would think on Suits or Better Call Saul. But law schools do like to see that you have real world exposure to the practice of law, that you know what it's really like, that you're not going on a whim or for lack of a better option or because you have unrealistic expectations. I wouldn't get a legal internship in the hopes that it'll help you get into law school, though. That time is probably better spent actually studying for the LSAT. But if you're not sure whether law is actually right for you, it might not be a bad idea. And you would network to get that internship. You could reach out to folks on LinkedIn, alums of the university or college that you're currently attending, network through friends and family, apply broadly, reach out to every law firm in your area. You only need one to say yes and to get lucky. And that could potentially help you get into law school, but more importantly, it'll help you decide better, make a more informed decision about whether law is actually what you want to do. Of course, if you don't love it, doesn't mean that law school isn't for you, just means that maybe that particular type of law or that particular law firm is not the right one for you, but it will give you more concrete information to make a more informed decision. Do the research now, by the way. It's better to decide now whether law school is right for you than after you've already attended law school. There are plenty of people with JDs who don't practice law and don't like the law, and they might have been better off avoiding it altogether. But law can be great depending on what you want to do. And thanks for all the great questions, folks. I'm just scanning through more that I might have missed earlier. Got a question you're asking, is it recommended to apply in the state you plan to work in? So should you go to law school where you want to ultimately practice? Not a bad idea, but you don't actually need to. Of course, a law school will typically prepare you for that state's bar, but then there's also the uniform bar exam, which is accepted by most states in the US. And so if they're preparing you for the uniform bar exam, then you could, of course, go to law school in that state and still easily work somewhere else. But then you also have the California bar, the New York bar, of course. Do the research. There's 50 states out there. I don't know the details of all of them, but definitely worth considering, of course. If you go to a top 14 law school, then you will have a lot of prestige associated with your JD and your graduate, your JD and your resume, and then you'll be employable in many different states. But if you're wanting to work regionally, locally, and then maybe going to a more regional law school in that state might be a better idea. I got a question here asking, I'm a senior. I have a 4.6 GPA. Didn't know that was possible. Whoa. And want to go to law school and have a 1450 SAT. I just need options. So if you're talking about the SAT, are you still in high school? Are you a high school senior? I mean, before we talk about law school, we got to talk about undergrad, right? I think I'm glad that you're here, but it might be premature to talk about law school admissions. Maybe you want to focus on college admissions first, because ultimately law school admissions will be focused on your LSAT score and your undergraduate GPA, not your high school GPA or your SAT score. And so I would say for now, just focus on getting the highest possible GPA in undergrad, explore whether law school is right for you. And then once you've done that, then you can always study for the LSAT as a sophomore or a junior and then apply. But get into college, maintain a high undergraduate GPA, come back in a couple of years, the LSAT's not going anywhere, and that'll give you some time to explore whether law school is actually right for you. I see Brasia Kyle is asking, I'm currently doing my undergrad degree in the UK, but I want to practice law in the US. Any tips? Okay, well, I mean, you can certainly practice law in the US if you go to law school in the US, or you can go to law school in the UK or elsewhere, and then I think it's an LLM that you've got to get to be admitted to the bar in the US. Know that if you go to law school, if you go to undergrad outside the US and you want to get your JD in the US, they're not going to consider your undergraduate GPA because, to be frank, they're not going to be sure how to interpret it. And so if you are an international applicant, meaning that you earned your undergrad outside the US, they don't factor in your GPA into their calculations, and that weight gets transferred onto your LSAT score. So your LSAT score becomes relatively more important, and they'll see your GPA for context, of course, but the transcript won't be factored into their calculations, technically speaking. And then, of course, more weight perhaps on your essays as well, like your personal statement and such. Rosie's asking, what's a high GPA? So high GPA is all relative to the law school that you're considering, right? We want to look at the GPA median for any given law school specifically, and that will vary depending on the school. There's 200 or so different ABA approved law schools with all different requirements. And so I would say that high is at or above that given law school's 75th percentile. Not their median, but their 75th. That's the number I would target more or less. But of course, no reason to shoot for anything less than a 4.0 in my opinion, just like you don't want to go for any question, any LSAT score below a 180. I see lots of questions here, trying to get to as many as I can. Thanks for all these. Please keep them coming. And I'm trying to answer the ones that I haven't answered earlier today or recently that I think I can give a more substantive answer to. So apologies if I'm not getting to every single one. I'm trying to answer the questions that I think will help the greatest number of people. Sanjay's asking, what undergrad degree do you think most prepares you for law school? I would think any major where you're reading and interpreting difficult, dense text. So philosophy, maybe. The people who write the LSAT are actually philosophy PhDs. So that would certainly help you on the LSAT, perhaps. And fun fact, those who do best on the LSAT are oftentimes philosophy majors, not criminal justice majors or pre-law majors. It could be a chicken egg thing, of course, though maybe the people who major in philosophy are already predisposed to do well on the LSAT, but maybe the skills they build in philosophy also help them with the LSAT. And just like you're interpreting difficult, dense text in philosophy, you're also interpreting difficult, dense text in case law. So could perhaps be helpful there. But balance this consideration with the fact that you also want to maintain a high GPA for law school admissions. DJ Walton's asking, what's your opinion on a non-ABA law school if I don't have any need or intention of leaving Alabama? Well, When a law school is not ABA accredited, you want to consider why is it not accredited, right? Do they have good bar passage rates? Do they have good employment outcomes? And are you absolutely certain that you're never going to leave your home state? You don't want to be unnecessarily geographically limited if you have a need to relocate because of family or a significant other, or life can take you many strange places, right? I mean, you might have decades ahead of you where you might want to, at some point, go somewhere else. And so, if you are absolutely certain that you're not going to leave your state, then maybe you could go non-ABA. But look at the stats specifically. Ask them tough questions because you're investing 3 years of your life in tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so I typically recommend going ABA in virtually every case. Of course, if you could get a full ride and pay zero in tuition, maybe even get a living stipend on top of that, then of course, different story, but consider this carefully. See a question from KK Newley asking about walkthroughs on logical reasoning and reading comprehension. So I actually do have those on the YouTube channel. If you click through the link in my bio, you'll get to my YouTube channel, and there you'll see the live tab where I have the recordings of this live and all the previous lives I've ever done. Then if you click over to the videos tab on the channel, you'll see all of my other YouTube videos, and you can also search the channel. I've done different walkthroughs on virtually every single LSAT question type, both logical reasoning and reading comprehension. So if you search the word flaw or weaken or strengthen or just reading, you'll see a lot of those walkthroughs on there. And so you can feel free to dive in there for more beyond the context of what I can do in a live right here. Plenty of recordings there on the channel. Happy to point you in the right direction if you wanted to DM me, happy to help. Rosie's asking, if I have a degree in math, would you consider my reading comprehension level behind others? I mean, I honestly wouldn't be in a position to interpret your reading comprehension level or make any assumptions just based on your degree. In fact, math majors and comp sci majors also do quite well on the LSAT, similar to philosophy majors. And it could be that they're more predisposed to the type of logic that the LSAT's testing, or they're learning something that helps them with the LSAT. But I wouldn't make any assumptions here. Honestly, let's put it to the test. Let's have you take a cold diagnostic practice test and let that tell the story and see where you're at. You'll just take you sitting down for 2.5 hours, take a full practice test. You can get one for free on LSAC's Law Hub platform, and you'll be able to work through it and get a gauge of where you stand. Of course, don't take it as indicative of your potential. Just take it as a benchmark of where you're at right now and a way for you to measure your future progress. But I would think that you're also perfectly capable of conquering the LSAT just like anybody else is. And if you'd like my help boosting up your LSAT score, I'm offering the free LSAT tutoring lessons for everybody watching this now or later. The link to book that free call with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. The link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and Instagram as well. Open offer for everybody watching this now or later. I see Bridget's asking, in my first year, when do you think it's a good time to do my LSAT? I mean, your LSAT score is good for 5 years. So hypothetically, you could start studying now and take it at the end of your first year or early in your second year as a sophomore maybe, but you also don't need to do it now. You could just focus on undergrad for now, exploring law, making sure it's really what you want to do. Then you could come back to it in a year or so, then take it, and you'll still be fine that way. Also, if you wanted to take a gap year or two between undergrad and law school, your score is not going to expire. Your scores are good for 5 years, of course. Take it whenever you're ready. Take it whenever you have the time to carve out in your schedule to make it a focus, right? Because studying properly for the LSAT, ideally you want to put in a minimum of 5 to 10 hours a week to make steady forward progress, and ideally closer to 10, 15, 20 hours a week of studying. So if you have a lighter course load the coming semester, or you have some more free time over the summer, maybe you want to study for it this summer and take it late summer, early fall. Just scanning through for more questions here, folks. Thanks for asking them and keep them coming. I see Justine's asking, if I have a 3.0 undergrad GPA, what should I aim for on the LSAT? Well, I always recommend aiming for a 180. No reason to shoot for anything less. But a 3.0 GPA, to be frank, it's below the medians for most, if not all, law schools, just because grade inflation is real. And so you'd probably be what we call a splitter applicant, which just means you're going to have a relatively lower GPA below the medians, and you're going to want to balance it out with a relatively higher LSAT score to compensate. So you might want to look at the stats for the law schools that you're targeting and say, okay, well, I'm this much below the GPA median, therefore I want to be that much above the LSAT median to compensate. Just being real about it. Again, feel free to book the call with me if you want to talk through what your prep could look like. And to Sapi's question, yes, the LSAT is the main factor in law school admissions. It's your LSAT score number 1, GPA number 2. The soft factors like your application essays are a distant third because they're not quantitative in the same way. I think there was a personal statement question that I might have missed. I'm just looking for that one. Yeah, so how do you stand out in law school applications besides your LSAT score? So I mentioned some of the factors, right? So there's your LSAT GPA, personal statement, optional essays, addenda, character and fitness statement, your resume, your letters of rec. Your letters of rec could be from professors in undergrad. They could also be from employers. If it's been several years since you were in undergrad, you don't need to have a letter from a professor. You could ask employers instead, or volunteer supervisors, community leaders, anyone who knows you well and you've worked under them in some capacity, so they can speak to your work ethic, your character, your persistence, your dedication. All of that's good to have. If you have some time and you don't have those relationships, start cultivating them now. It takes time. Regarding character and fitness statements, those are going to be related to any arrests or convictions, misdemeanors, felonies. Those questions vary by state because they relate to the questions that the state bar will ask you after you graduate law school. And so you want to look very carefully at the wording of those questions. So if you have some sort of criminal record, you want to look at, were you arrested? Were you convicted? If you were arrested but the charges were dismissed or sealed, you were still technically arrested, so you still want to disclose that. If they ask whether you were convicted and you weren't, of course, maybe you don't need to. But look at those questions very carefully for each law school application, because if you apply to law schools in multiple states, the questions may vary state by state. So maybe for one statement, you will not need to disclose, but for another law school's character and fitness statement, you will need to disclose. So just be very careful about that. If you fail to disclose, and you should have disclosed, that could come back to bite you later when you go before the bar. A lie of omission is still a lie, and you would not want to have problems not getting your JD, not getting your law license, or not getting your law license because you had failed to disclose. So just be very careful about that. Consult someone else for advice if necessary. I see Xavier is asking about police reports not arrested. If you weren't arrested, then you weren't arrested. I mean, the particulars matter here. So when we say police report, what exactly do we mean? Like, did you get written up in some way, but you weren't actually arrested? Then that was not an arrest and you could be okay, most likely. I can't say definitively yes or no, though, without knowing all the particulars. And when in doubt, you can also ask law schools. You're not going to get denied just because there was a police report about you. There are people who've gotten misdemeanors and felonies for all sorts of things who still went to law school, so it's not an automatic denial or anything like that. Also, be careful about questions related to academic integrity, like if you were cited for plagiarism, or there was something that wasn't police related in nature, but you still got in trouble on the campus. That sort of thing you might need to disclose as well if there was any sort of disciplinary record. See a question about GPAs when transferring from community college to four-year university. And so your LSAC calculated GPA is going to factor in every class that goes into comprising your bachelor's. And so they're going to take your community college classes as well as your university classes and combine them all together to determine your LSAC calculated GPA. And that is the GPA that matters. That's what goes to the American Bar Association, which in turn is pulled by U.S. News for inclusion in the U.S. News rankings. Now, your master's GPA is not going to factor into that at all. It's just your undergraduate bachelor's GPA. And if you took high school classes that factored into your undergrad GPA, those can count as well. And yes, your GPA can, to some extent, offset your LSAT score, but also know that your LSAT weighs more heavily than your GPA. And so the easiest way to boost your odds is going to be to retake the LSAT and get a higher score. That's the number one thing you can do at this point, because redoing all of undergrad or redoing a couple of college classes will not have redoing only a couple of classes won't have a significant impact, because each class is only a small fraction of undergrad, right? Because if you're redoing 3 credits or 6 credits out of 120 or so, that's pretty marginal, pretty insignificant, only like 5-10%, not really super impactful. But but your LSAT scores 1 day, 2.5 hours weighs more heavily, so you're going to get more return on time invested there. And Loop's asking, do you think the application process differs greatly from if I'm in my late 30s trying to get into law school versus applying right out of college? So yeah, so a KJD, someone going directly from kindergarten all the way through to law school with no breaks, is going to be a different sort of applicant than somebody who applies later in life after having worked between undergrad and law school. The longer you've been out of undergrad, the less that your undergraduate GPA matters, and the more your LSAT score is going to matter. And of course, they will carve out some space for considering your work experience as well. And the reason they discount your undergraduate GPA is because who you were at 20 or so is not who you are at 38, 39, 40, right? You're a different person, you've matured, you've evolved and changed. And so they're going to weigh your LSAT score more, because they're going to take it as being more indicative of your abilities now at this point in life. Felipe is asking, do employment gaps look bad on a resume when applying to law school? I'll say this, it's not a huge deal, but you also never want to leave them with any unanswered questions. And so if somebody looking at your resume is going to be like, what was he or she doing for the last 5-10 years? You want to talk about that, maybe in an addendum or in one of your essays. If it's 3 to 6 months at some point in the past, maybe not a huge deal. And if you're unemployed right now and you're not in school right now, maybe you want to take on some volunteer work or an internship just to have something going on, or a part-time job, and you could potentially simultaneously study for the LSAT during that period to use that time productively for law school admissions if you can. And to the question around work experience here, I mean, I think that work experience always matters. And because the US News rankings now devote more weight to employment outcomes than they used to, I think that work experience could play more of a role than it used to as well. So in other words, your employability is something law schools care about. They want to know that you are likely to get a job that requires a JD within 9 months after graduating from law school. Because if too many of the grads did not get a job that requires a JD, that's going to look bad for them. And it's going to hurt them for if it's really bad, it could even hurt their ABA accreditation, but at the very least, it would hurt them in the rankings. And so they want to admit people who have high LSAT scores, have high GPAs, are likely to succeed in law school and also pass the bar exam, and also get a job that requires a JD. So if you had an interview with a law school and you showed up disheveled and you couldn't put a sentence together, that might hurt you in admissions for real. Most law schools don't offer interviews, but some do. There's also the Kira interviews where you're on video answering questions. You can also request an informational interview from a law school where you get on a Zoom call or a phone call with them and talk to them, asking them some detailed, nuanced questions about the school. And that's also a good chance for you to make an impression on them, and that will go in your file, of course. So you show up to that dressed well, well-spoken, asking good questions, doing the research, that can certainly help. Michael's asking, how much does course rigor and undergraduate institution matter or influence your law school application? Well, your GPA matters the most. But if you took tons of classes that were clearly jokes, like the hypothetical underwater basket weaving, that would not look good. But GPA first and foremost. But take some classes where you're reading, where you're writing, where you're also building the skills that are going to help you with the LSAT into law school and beyond. So it's ultimately a balance. But you don't need to have gone to an Ivy League undergrad to get into a good law school. And for many folks, if you're anyone watching this is in high school right now deciding where to go to college, you might want to go to a school that is cheaper, that is public, and save some money for law school. Because once you have your JD, where you earned your JD is going to matter a lot more for the rest of your career and your employability than where you went to undergrad. So you might want to go to a state school, a public university, pay in-state tuition, save some money, and then take on, then that way you'll have less overall education-related debt after you graduate law school. All right, glad these are all helping A. Yeah. So yeah, folks, if you're enjoying these lives, by the way, I do these every single weekday, same time, same place, at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific, here on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, wherever you're watching this. If you find this helpful, please spread the word, share it in Discord, subreddits, Facebook groups, group chats, share it to your socials. The only way this grows is through word of mouth. I don't do any advertising for these, and the algo doesn't boost them because they can't run ads during lives. And so your spreading the word does make a difference, and I do appreciate it. I see DJs saying that I visited a law school and they really encouraged me to go ahead and apply before the LSAT. Bad idea. Yeah, so I mean, law schools will always encourage you to apply because part of how they're ranked is their selectivity. So if they can get more people to apply, they can deny more people and their acceptance rate goes down, which means their selectivity goes up. And so it's in their interest to get you to apply. And many of them, of course, charge application fees, so it makes money for them too. They're lining up with their incentives, which are not your incentives. And they're not going to consider your application until you have your LSAT score anyway, right? So there's no reason to apply early. And you want to make informed decisions about where it makes sense to apply based on what your LSAT score is. So you could get everything ready, then wait till you get your LSAT score back and hit submit the very same day. But to apply to Harvard Law, when you have no LSAT score, you take the LSAT cold and you get a 150, probably not going to be competitive at Harvard Law, no point in applying. But there are hundreds, if not thousands of people who make pointless applications to Harvard Law every single year because they just figure they'll shoot your shot and Harvard Law gets those application fees, and that's part of what helps their selectivity. But better to wait to apply, but you can hit submit the same day your LSAT score comes back. And maybe, of course, you take the LSAT, it's not what you wanted, you retake it, and then you have better odds upon a retake and applying after you take it for the second or third time. That might be the better course of action. And of course, if you are preparing for the LSAT, whether you're taking it in April or June or August or beyond, I'm offering free LSAT tutoring lessons for everybody watching this now or later. The link to book that free call with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. Link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and Instagram as well. Open offer for everyone. I'll be back on Monday, same time, same place. I'll see you all then. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care. Thanks for joining.